Mini episode 1182 of the FDH Lounge is brought to you by Sportsology, delivering unconventional columns and webcasts about sports, TV, music, movies, and more. Follow them on the web at sportsology.com.
The FDH Lounge. You'll want to schedule your life around it.
A long time ago, on a gloomy, wet Cleveland spring night, two men stand alone amidst the late-night drizzle. Their voices echo across the vacant station parking lot as they debate the merits of the great American radio show that have been missing for far too long. On that night, an idea was born. That idea became the FDH Lounge. Welcome to the FDH Lounge.
Hello and welcome to FDH Lounge mini episode 1182, our FDH 2019-2020 NFL Divisional Weekend preview. We'll go through the whole slate of games. In college games through the national championship, we are 72, 59, and 2 for the year. Our NFL picks last week were 1 and 3 for the year. That's 116, 139, and 5 overall, 20, 30, and 1 on the big three, and 7 and 10 on the locks. Before we begin, a reminder that at the FDH Lounge Multimedia Magazine, at the FDHLounge.blogspot.com, we have up our ultimate quantitative baseline, UQB statistic. It simply adds together the ranking of 13 different indexes, the FDH Power Rankings, strength of schedule based on our Power Rankings, a metric that combines the Power Rankings with impressiveness of victories based on strength of schedule, offensive yards gained, offensive passing yards, offensive rushing yards, defensive yards allowed, defensive passing yards, defensive rushing yards, DVOA, offensive DVOA, defensive DVOA, and special teams DVOA. It's a great guide to help you assess how these teams measure up. Up first on Saturday, the Niners are favored by 7 against Minnesota. While the game feels like a foregone conclusion, so too did it feel that way in the divisional round of the 1987-1988 playoffs when the unheralded Vikes, also in the first game of the weekend, came in and pulled the upset against the top seed 49ers in an echo of history that is uncanny. San Francisco is third on our power rankings and first on the UQB, while Minnesota is 10th in power rankings and tied for 10th in UQB. The Niners have an edge in strength of schedule, offensive yards, offensive passing yards, defensive yards, and defensive passing yards. The Vikings only have a tiny edge in defensive rushing yards and no advantage at all in any other category. Regardless of actual seeding, most pundits seem to consider New Orleans and San Fran as the two best teams in the NFC field, so it'd be a monumental feat for Minnesota to go on the road in consecutive weeks and take them both out. But there's no realistic scenario here in terms of matchups for them to prevail, and we won't look for the back door, so we're on the home faves. Next up, the Ravens are favored by 9.5 at home against Tennessee in a rematch of the 2000-2001 Divisional Playoffs. Baltimore is first on our power rankings and second on the UQB, while Tennessee is 12th on the power rankings and tied for 10th in UQB. The Ravens have an edge in DVOA, offensive yards, defensive DVOA, defensive yards, defensive passing yards, defensive rushing yards, and special teams DVOA, while Tennessee has the edge in strength of schedule. If the Titans are able to force the Ravens out of their comfort zone by getting up on them and forcing them away from their run-heavy offense, that's at least a scenario. But it doesn't seem terribly likely since Baltimore is very good at stopping what Tennessee does best, namely unleashing Derrick Henry. We'll take the points since this game shapes up to be close throughout, but the Titans are unlikely to advance. On Sunday, the Chiefs are at home laying 9.5 to the Texans. Kansas City is 4th in the power rankings and 5th in UQB, while Houston is 7th in power rankings and tied for 17th in UQB. The Chiefs have an edge in DVOA, offensive yards, offensive passing yards, defensive DVOA, defensive yards, and defensive passing yards, while the Titans have an edge in strength of schedule and rushing yards. Given that KC improved throughout the year defensively to at least be a middle-of-the-pack team in that regard, Houston's weaknesses defensively would seem to preclude them from being able to keep up even with J.J. Watt back. Since Kansas City is weak against the run, albeit Houston is too, if the Texans can successfully implement a strategy of chewing up the clock and keeping Patrick Mahomes on the sidelines, with perhaps 35 to 37 minutes on the time of possession, they could pull the upset. But that seems like too much of a long shot. We'll take the Chiefs to cover. In the nightcap, Green Bay is favored by 5.5 in the latest of a number of interesting 21st century playoff clashes against the Seahawks. Seattle is 6th in the power rankings and 9th in UQB, while Green Bay is 5th in the power rankings and 15th in the UQB. The Seahawks have an edge in strength of schedule, offensive yards, and offensive rushing yards, while the Packers have the edge in defensive yards and defensive passing yards. Just like in the earlier game, the Road Dogs have a chance to exploit the run defense of the home team based on the respective strengths and weaknesses, but the 2020s version of Marshawn Lynch is not responsible for those gaudy regular season numbers for the Hawks, so that theory seems to go bye-bye. However, the Pack played the softest schedule in the league on our metrics, a factor that has meant something in past playoff games, and Seattle, of course, was much better there. And a matchup of imperfect teams, to say the least, will take the Road Dogs to not only cover but win, and set up another epic chapter in their rivalry with Frisco on Championship Sunday. Thank you for tuning in to this mini episode of the FDH Lounge.